Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today to talk about project engagement and how you can use a metric called the product engagement score to create better experiences for your customers and build better products. So what is product engagement score? It's really an up-level view that combines some simple metrics that are used throughout the industry currently, such as stickiness, feature adoption, and retention, and combines those in a way to give you a single metric that you can really strive and look towards with a North Star metric. So how do you measure this? There's different ways that you can measure it, but for the purposes of this conversation, we'll just keep it simple and use one example where we evenly weight and take an average of stickiness, feature adoption, and retention. So why does it matter? It's a good metric to have, just to have an up-level view of how everything is performing. It's something that you can report out on and get everyone aligned and just have a good understanding of, are the things and efforts that we're doing, whether that's from a product, marketing, sales, enablement, anything that you're doing to help improve your product and your customer experience, how are those impacting kind of a bottom line or single metric that we can look at holistically? So stickiness, it's a measure of how many users are returning to your product on a regular basis. There's two main ways that companies measure this, either the percent of daily active users to monthly active users or the weekly active users to monthly active users. And which one you use really depends on the type of business that you have. So why does it matter? I mean, I would just sum this up by saying, what excites people enough to keep them coming back and to stick around with your product? That's really what stickiness answers as far as, what is driving people to go back to your product? What gets them excited? So what is feature adoption? Feature adoption is a way to understand how many people of your total active user base are actually using a specific feature or set of features in your product. So it can be measured in two different ways. For the purpose of this conversation, we'll focus more on number one. What we're saying is the feature-based analysis, but also just mention the second one because some people find value in that as well. So again, as I mentioned at the start, it's what percentage of through a single time period. In this example, we have a month, used a specific feature divided by the total number of users in that same time period. Again, a month here, or just active at all in your application. The second one is a more of a portfolio view. It's almost taking the Pareto analysis approach of the 80-20 rule. And that's more of a holistic view as to what percent of your features that you've built. If you built 10 features, is it two of those features or 20% of them that make up 80% of the click volume? It's just a way to understand what's really important and what's driving a lot of the usage from your product. So why does it matter? I mean, feature adoption is really, it's two things. It's aligning the expectations that you had when you went out and started to build the product. And it's also just a measure of, just from the customer's shoes, it's, hey, am I getting that like quick realization of value, those aha moments? And not only just am I getting it once, but am I continuing to get it over time? So retention, it measures how many customers a company holds onto over a given period of time. And it can be looked at from a product-based view, a feature-based view, or just entire application view of, hey, did this group of customers, after let's say they first came in and joined my product, are they keep coming back month over month over month? So how to measure retention? You can virtually use any time period you want. For this example here, we're just going to use 3 months. But let's just dive right in, just because I think this is one that seems a little bit more nebulous. But once you get an example here, it's really easy to follow along. So in this chart here, what I'm actually going to do is just start really simple, start really small, and we'll jump straight to the third row of this chart here where it says June 2019 with 21 visitors. And we're just going to read this from left to right. And so what this is saying is that in June 2019, we had 21 visitors that were new to our application. And in month 0, you see for all 4 of the rows that 100% of the people are there, which makes sense because we're just saying, hey, if you came in June, then yes, you used the product in June. As you move over to the right, we go from 100% to 81% for month 1. So that's saying of the 21 users that used the product in June, 81% of those 21 still use the product again in July, meaning you lost 19% of customers. Same thing as you continue on to the right to month 2, when you now have August. And this is saying that 57% of your original 21 visitors are still using the product 2 months into it. Now, generally what you expect to see with retention is a steeper drop and then kind of a flattening, which is kind of the goal of retention. You want to keep that drop as short as possible and have that level of support where that line starts to flatten out as high as you can. So retention is really most valuable when evaluated over time. It really ensures that the customers you've acquired are getting the value that they expected to get out of the product when they first signed up for it. So again, this is the same slide that we saw earlier, but with a little bit more detail than before. And this is just getting a little bit into the weeds more with the calculation. So best practices, just idea number one, keep it simple. Next, because of what I just said, number one, I think it underlines it even more. Focus on your own number, not necessarily what your competitors report, and track your number over time as a way to gauge if you're being successful or not. Next, once you start to get, the keep it simple and you have the right measurements in place, you can make this even more powerful by applying it to certain populations of individuals. And you can say, hey, how are my promoters versus my detractors versus my passives doing as far as PES if I only apply it to this population? Or how are my enterprise accounts comparing to my SMB or startup accounts? What does that look like as far as the differences in the number? Lastly, and again, this goes back into number two about tailoring it to your needs. Adjust the weights between the three of these to really fit your needs. All right, stickiness best practices. So one of the key things that I get asked a lot when people are talking about, hey, Rob, I want to start measuring stickiness. What should I measure? Should I use daily? Should I use weekly? And the answer to that is it really depends on the nuance of your business. But it's a really easy question to answer once you get it conceptually. Next, be critical on what active means. So again, stickiness is a measure of active users over another measure of active users. I would keep them consistent as far as the numerator and the denominator. However, I wouldn't just necessarily automatically default to logging in, or did they just touch my website, or did they open my app? Because that's not necessarily going to mean that they're actually getting value out of the product. So feature adoption, best for practices. You got to really contextualize the rates that you're targeting. And this is more, not as much about the metrics, but just think about there's going to be really different feature adoption based on the type of products that you're pushing out. So if it's something that you expect to be used by the entire company and every single customer that you have, you might expect higher numbers than if this is a very specific workflow that only one person in the entire company might need to use in order for that whole company or customer to get value out of it. Which brings me to number two. You can apply feature adoption to different populations. You don't necessarily have to just view it from a visitor situation. Lastly, identify the right features to be included. You can do feature adoption from a single feature view. You can do it from a collection of feature views. But my recommendation is just really start small. So what is the most important action that a user can take, and start there. Next, retention. Align your metric date based on your needs. Earlier we mentioned 3-month retention is a good recommendation, but that might not be appropriate for your business. Now, another thing, just like with stickiness, you really got to choose your measure for activity here, because you could just say, yes, we have great retention. We have 80% retention for over 3 months because everyone is just logging into the app. But if you really don't know what those users are doing once they get in the app and you just know they're logging in, that might not really align with the value they're getting. So now let's get into some tactical recommendations. So we've talked a lot about how to measure things, which I think is I spend a lot of time on that just because I think it's so important to really understand what you're measuring and measure the right things before you just start going wild with this new metric. So we have a list of 7 items here. I'm just going to go ahead and dive right into the first one. So product market fit. It's something that will really impact which of these 3 from the product engagement score are most useful to you at a certain time. When you're looking at your initial concept and first customers and you're just starting out, it might be really important to assess feature adoption and stickiness. As you move towards the predictable revenue and then the actual predictable revenue stages where, what you thought was actually predictable revenue, you realize it's not. And then later you actually realize that retention is one that you might think becomes more important throughout time. And the last one, demand outweighing capacity, just thanks to a lot of the infrastructure and platform infrastructure as a service providers we have out here. For a lot of the software-based companies, this is really not a situation that happens. But for more your traditional manufactured products, this is something that does happen on the product market fit line. First time user experience. This one is huge, if not the most important thing. You should be able to get them straight to value as soon as possible. And with that, I plan ahead for idle time here. I think sometime, if you install something and it needs some time to collect data, or if there's a big pre-sale cycle that they have to go through before being able to try out your product, just think about ways to minimize that. And then lastly, think about what I'm calling here a champion checklist. So you have a bunch of customers now, let's say, and there's some that you're like, yes, customer XYZ, they're the best. They talk about how much they love us. Think about the actions that they take inside their product, inside your product. So Engaging and re-engaging users. Now I have the usual channels and rewards, reward people for coming back to your application, give them a reason to do so. And the channels that you can do that with push notifications, emails, and whatnot. But I think it's really important to think about using that in a way that creates usage habits and that offers precise and meaningful messaging, and also could bring in users to get their input specifically. Second, if you are going to ask for their time, make them feel special about it and maybe show them some new things that are in the pipeline. If you have mocks or user experience sessions, or just in general wanting their feedback on something new that's being developed. And lastly, offer precise and meaningful and contextual messaging. Next, these next three slides are really going to focus on NPS and the general buckets of populations of users here, with champions, passives, and detractors. And really, I think as we talked about earlier with the customer checklist for your champion checklist, what are the things that these users do when they find value? Really drive to understand that. Next, show some love and empathize with your detractors. I think if I'm looking at our own NPS submissions and the text that's provided with it, it's never exciting to see a detractor, but it's also inspiring usually because the content they provide, and when customers are willing to do it and say, here's what speaks well to me, and here's just where this misses the mark entirely. That's usually so valuable for you in many ways. It can help you understand how to improve your products. It can understand how to improve messaging, understand how to improve enablement. There's so many things that you can do that will really help make your product better. Lastly, passives. So passives, I think, are even less talked about than detractors or, our champions, just because people think really in the extremes. They're like, hey, this is really good. I feel good with my champions and my promoters. And on the other end, these are the people that really don't like us. But the passives you see sometimes and you shrug and you're like, oh, okay. But I really think that's a missed opportunity. And why I say that is because these are the people that are closest to becoming promoters and champions for your company that then you can use and continue to grow that army of people who are giving you good feedback or believing in your product or giving you referrals for customers when someone says, hey, I don't want to speak to your company directly. I want to speak to someone who uses your product so I can really dive in and understand from the unbiased opinion what the product is like and what value I would get out of it as a customer. And lastly, understand your competition. This one's really a given, but I think some people just miss this a little bit too much. You get out there and get your hands dirty. Use the products that your competitors offer. Really, just the best way to understand how they are going to do better than you for certain cases, or really even identifying your strengths, is just to go use it yourself. Next, ask your former prospects. Just like the detractors that we talked about earlier, this can be an uncomfortable situation. But as me as a product manager, we're used to saying no to a lot of people just because we have to prioritize all the time. So being on the other end of that, I think it's something that we can especially empathize with. So what I mean by this is if you have a customer that ended up going with one of your competitors or just didn't go with your solution at all and just decided to try to maybe build something in-house, talk to them, say, hey, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much. We would be interested if we could talk a little bit more about the reasoning behind your decision. And worst case scenario, they say no. But, with even just taking that action itself, you're letting them know you care and you're really opening yourself up to a good opportunity to learn more about ways that you can improve your product, maybe your selling experience or anything about it that really got those customers looking at something else. Lastly, leverage your network. And what I mean by this is, I don't see this enough, I feel like, on LinkedIn, where I love when I see these sort of messages that just say, hey, I'm evaluating product XYZ. Has anyone used these before? And I think that's just a really good way to understand. Because again, it's like understanding, and using the competition yourself or asking people who want something else. You can just put those messages out there. And usually, I've had some great conversations myself, just regardless of where I've been working. Of someone has spent 15 minutes, 20 minutes talking to me about something. If you're going to meet up with them, maybe buy them a drink or some lunch or whatnot, just to make them just show some extra gratitude for their time. But I think it's really awesome and a great opportunity to just ask, put it out there. Again, the worst case that is going to happen in really any of these situations is just someone's going to say no, and that's okay.